Hey guys, tonight we will delve deep into a story of love and betrayal that changed the history of England forever. History echoes a chilling riddle. Why did King Henry VIII dare to send Anne Boleyn to the scaffold, yet never dared to harm a single hair on the head of Catherine of Aragon? Both women defied his power. Both stood in the way of what he wanted, but one died in the peace of a queen, while the other died by the sound of the sword of injustice. King Henry VIII, a king so desperate for an heir that he was willing to declare war on the Pope and cast aside his faithful wife. But what happens when his second wife, the woman he did everything to marry, also fails to bear him a son? Was it love for the Spanish princess, or merely fear of a mighty empire? Or was it a cold, calculated political maneuver, revealing the dark truth about pride and the deadly game at the Tudor court? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are listening from and what the current local time is where you are. Knowing where you are relaxing helps me feel more connected to this lulling journey. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. King Henry VIII, the monarch who ruled England from the year 1509 to 1547, carried within him an immense ambition to leave behind a son who would inherit the Tudor throne. In an era when male bloodlines symbolized power and stability, that obsession grew into a burning thirst within his mind. Year after year, as no prince was born to the court, Henry began to believe that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow, Princess Catherine of Aragon. The marriage between Henry and Catherine lasted more than 20 years, and was once considered one of the happiest and most exemplary unions in European royalty. Catherine bore him 6 children, but only one survived Princess Mary. The absence of a male heir made Henry feel humiliated and terrified that the future of his dynasty would collapse after his death. Haunted by destiny, Henry appealed to Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage, arguing that marrying his brother's widow violated the Holy Scripture. Yet the Pope, influenced by Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, refused his request. That refusal triggered a religious earthquake. Unwilling to accept defeat, Henry did something unprecedented in English history. He severed all ties with the Roman Catholic Church. In the year 1534, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, officially inaugurating the Reformation. With a single signature, he stripped the Pope of all power in England and granted himself the divine right to divorce and remarry as he pleased. The woman who drove him to defy Rome was Anne Boleyn, a young, sharp-witted and proud lady-in-waiting. Henry pursued her for 7 years, overcoming political and religious obstacles to place her upon the throne. On the first day of June, 1533, Anne was crowned Queen of England amid the cheers of the crowd and the admiration of courtiers. That same year, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Elizabeth. The king concealed his disappointment, comforting himself with the thought that the next one will be a son. Yet fate was not on their side. Anne's later pregnancies ended in sorrow, 1 miscarriage and 1 premature birth. Henry's patience soon ran dry. The king, who had once sworn he would change the world for her, grew cold, distant, and eventually blamed Anne for failing to give him a male heir. The stories of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn seemed parallel but ended in complete contrast. Both women loved Henry, both wore the crown, and both refused to bow to his unreasonable will. Catherine, after years of fighting to defend her honour and faith, died in January of 1536 at Kimbolton Castle, far from her daughter, yet proudly proclaiming herself the true Queen of England. Meanwhile, only 4 months later, on the 19th day of May that same year, Anne mounted the scaffold at Tower Green, dressed in a black velvet gown trimmed with white ermine, bowing her head beneath the sword of a French executioner. Why did Henry VIII allow Catherine to die peacefully while Anne faced public execution? Both had angered him, both had defied him, and neither had given him the son he so desperately desired. The answer lay not in love, nor in hatred, but in the cold calculations of power, in wounded pride, and in the intricate political chess of the Tudor court. Henry was not merely a man obsessed with fathering a son, he was a king, haunted by his reflection in history, and to protect his legacy, he was willing to sacrifice anyone, even those who had once meant everything to him. Tonight, as candlelight flickers upon the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, Imagine the wind carrying Anne's final prayer and Catherine's proud whisper from afar. These two women, one dying in quiet dignity, the other in public humiliation, forever stand, as mirrors reflecting one raw truth. Power can bestow a crown, but it can also take a life with a single stroke of the sword. Catherine of Aragon was no ordinary queen. She was born into the most powerful dynasty of her age, the Spanish royal family. Her mother was Isabella I of Castile, her father Ferdinand II of Aragon. The two sovereigns who united Spain, financed the voyages of Cristoforo Colombo, and drove the Moors from Granada in the year 1492. From infancy, Catherine's world was one of grandeur and discipline. She was educated in philosophy and theology, fluent in 6 languages, and raised not merely as a princess, but as a ruler in waiting. Her tutors spoke of her as the daughter of Catholic majesty, a woman destined to reign, not merely to adorn a throne. Yet the most powerful weapon Catherine possessed was not her intellect or her piety, it was her bloodline. She was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, who reigned over vast dominions stretching across Europe and the New World. His empire encompassed Spain, Germany, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and territories in the Americas, making him, arguably, the most powerful man on earth. Henry VIII knew this all too well. If he dared harm his Spanish queen, Charles could cross the Channel and bring the weight of an empire upon England. It was not an empty threat. In the year 1534, when Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, he sent the Bishop of Durham to Catherine's residence. The bishop's mission was to persuade her to acknowledge the king's new religious authority, to renounce the Pope and bow to Henry as her spiritual sovereign. Catherine listened calmly and refused. Enraged, the bishop shouted, "I will have you executed for defiance." But Catherine's composure did not falter. She looked at him steadily and asked, "And who will give you that power?" Her voice, cold and regal, silenced the room. The bishop left without another word. He understood she was beyond his reach. Catherine's untouchability extended far beyond her nephew's armies. The English people, surprisingly, adored her. In a nation famous for distrusting foreigners, this devotion was nothing short of remarkable. For 24 years she had been their queen, humble, devout, generous. She prayed for hours each day, dressed simply, and gave alms to the poor. Her dignity and restraint won the affection of both nobles and commoners. When Henry went to war in France in the year 1513, he left Catherine as regent. During his absence, the Scots invaded from the north. The Queen did not panic. She gathered the troops, secured the borders, and entrusted command to Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey. The English army met the Scots at the Battle of Flodden on the 9th day of September, 1513, and triumphed. The Scottish King James IV was slain on the battlefield. Catherine sent Henry the blood-stained coat of the fallen king as a trophy of victory. That triumph sealed her reputation. To the people, she was not merely a queen, she was a saint, a defender of England itself. So when Henry later sought to divorce her, the reaction was explosive. Women armed themselves with pitchforks and blocked the royal commissioners sent to remove her from the palace. Crowds gathered in the streets shouting, "Death to your enemies." A priest who prayed for Queen Anne instead of Queen Catherine was beaten nearly to death by his own parishioners. London, York, and Lincoln whispered of rebellion. Henry understood what Catherine's death would mean. Riots, bloodshed, perhaps even civil war. Meanwhile, Charles V condemned Henry's actions before the papal court in Rome, calling the divorce the lust of a foolish man. He warned that a good and blameless queen must not suffer for her husband's desires. If Catherine were to die by force, he declared, she would become a martyr. Her image would be painted as that of a saintly victim, her story immortalized in churches, her memory kindling rebellion for generations. Henry could not risk such a legacy, but Catherine had one more layer of protection: her mind. She was not only born of kings, she thought like one. When Henry argued that their marriage was invalid because she had once been his brother's wife, Catherine turned his own reasoning into her shield. "If our marriage was never lawful," she said, "then I am not your wife. And if I am not your wife, I am not your subject. I am a Spaniard born, and English law has no hold upon me." It was a statement of pure brilliance. By Henry's own logic, She was a foreign princess residing in England outside the reach of his legal authority. As a foreigner, she could appeal to Rome, and that is precisely what she did. When in the year 1529 Cardinal Wolsey convened a court to decide the matter of the king's marriage, Catherine refused to attend. "I will not be judged by you," she said. "I appeal to Rome." Her calm defiance enraged Henry, who soon passed new laws forbidding any appeal to the Pope. But Catherine ignored them, insisting, "I am not the king's subject. These laws do not bind me." By exploiting the king's own argument, Catherine made herself legally untouchable. Henry could not execute her without igniting a European war, nor imprison her without violating international law. All he could do was move her from one castle to another, cutting her off from her daughter Mary, waiting for nature to take its course. And so, in January of 1536, the woman who had once ruled the heart of England passed away quietly in her bed at Kimbolton Castle. Outside her window, winter winds whispered through the grey sky. Inside, the last queen of the old faith crossed herself one final time. She had defied a king, withstood an empire, and left the world not as a victim, but as a sovereign in spirit. Catherine of Aragon died peacefully not because Henry forgave her, but because she had rendered herself untouchable. Catherine of Aragon did not rely solely on her royal blood or the devotion of the English people. Her sharpest weapon was her intellect, and the very logic Henry himself had used to condemn her marriage. Henry VIII had declared that his union with Catherine was invalid, claiming that it violated divine law. He insisted that marrying his brother's widow was forbidden by Scripture, citing the book of Leviticus. According to Henry, this unlawful act had cursed their marriage and deprived him of sons. It was this argument that he used to justify not only his request for annulment, but also his monumental decision to break from the Roman Catholic Church and create a new one under his own rule. Yet from the same argument, Catherine discovered her salvation. If their marriage had never been valid as Henry claimed, then she was not his lawful wife. And if she was not his wife, she was not his subject. She was, by her own words, a foreign princess residing in England. English law, therefore, had no authority over her. That realization became the cornerstone of her defense. In early 1529, the English court opened formal proceedings to determine the legitimacy of her marriage. Cardinal Wolsey presided, flanked by envoys loyal to Henry. Catherine entered the chamber calm and dignified, dressed in the sombre colours of her station. When ordered to speak, she refused to acknowledge their authority. Instead, she declared before all present, "I will not answer to you. I appeal to Rome." The silence that followed was heavy. Those words, spoken softly yet firmly, shattered the illusion that Henry could command her submission. Henry's rage was immediate. To him, Catherine's defiance was not merely a personal insult but a political rebellion. With the help of Thomas Cromwell, his newly rising advisor, he drafted a series of acts that would sever England's legal and spiritual ties to Rome. These statutes made the king the supreme head of all religious authority within his realm. They forbade any appeal to foreign courts, particularly to the Pope. But Catherine remained unmoved. "I am not the king's subject," she reminded them, "and these laws do not bind me." She continued to write letters to Pope Clement VII, appealing for intervention and insisting that Henry's actions were illegal under both canon and divine law. Ironically, Henry's own reasoning had cornered him. His claim that the marriage was unlawful became a legal paradox, one that Catherine turned against him. If the union was invalid, then she was by definition outside the reach of his new English church. Henry had cut off his own hand, as one ambassador remarked, by destroying the very legal ground upon which he might have punished her. Through this masterful inversion, Catherine became an anomaly in Tudor law, a woman simultaneously present within England and beyond its jurisdiction. Henry could neither try her in court nor imprison her without igniting outrage across Europe. Any act of force against her would have been an act of aggression against Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. England stood isolated, and Henry, though furious, understood that his options were narrowing. Thus began Catherine's quiet exile. Unable to punish her openly, Henry chose to isolate her from court. She was moved from Windsor to the Moor, then to Ampthill, and finally to Kimbolton Castle, each residence smaller and colder than the last. Guards watched her letters. Visitors were restricted. Even her daughter, Princess Mary, was forbidden to see her. The Queen, who had once presided over grand banquets, now dined alone beneath faded tapestries, surrounded by loyal attendants who dared not speak Henry's name. Still, Catherine remained unbroken. In her letters, she continued to sign herself Catherine the Queen, and she addressed Henry as "my lord and husband." Her dignity endured where her body could not. Years of confinement weakened her health. The winters in Cambridgeshire were damp and cruel. Yet even as her strength waned, she refused to renounce her title or her faith. By the winter of 1536, her body had begun to fail. On the 6th day of January, she received the sacrament and dictated her final letter to Henry. It was neither bitter nor accusatory. She forgave him, prayed for his soul, and asked him to care for their daughter Mary. The next morning she was found lifeless in her bed, her hands folded in prayer. Outside, frost covered the bare fields around Kimbolton. Inside, candles burned beside her, still form a final vigil for the woman who had defied a king and the tides of history. Catherine's death marked not a defeat, but a quiet triumph. By turning Henry's argument upon itself, she had rendered his power useless against her. No blade, no law, no royal decree could destroy her integrity. She left the world not as a discarded wife, but as a queen in spirit, her crown invisible, but eternal. Centuries later, historians would remember her not for the battle she lost, but for the one she won, the moral and legal victory of a woman who dared to face a king and hold her ground with nothing but truth and faith as her shield. In the end, Catherine of Aragon proved that intellect, when guided by conviction, can outlast even the might of a throne. Anne Boleyn was nothing like Catherine of Aragon. She was born in England around the year 1501, into a family of minor nobility with no royal blood to shield her. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a skilled diplomat, ambitious, intelligent, and well-connected, but far from possessing the strength or prestige of a great noble house. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, came from one of England's old families, yet even that lineage could not elevate the Boleyns into the ranks of the great dynasties of Europe. In short, Anne's rise would depend entirely on wit, charm, and circumstance. During her teenage years, Anne was sent to the Netherlands and later to France to serve at the court of Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I. It was there, amidst the splendour of the French Renaissance, that she learned the art of refinement, conversation, fashion, music, and diplomacy. The French court was a place of elegance and intellect, and Anne absorbed it all. By the time she returned to England in the early 1520s, she was transformed graceful, eloquent, and possessed of a spark that set her apart from the English ladies of her time. Upon her return, Anne became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. It was in this role that King Henry VIII first noticed her. At that moment, he was already known for his wandering eyes, and had taken numerous mistresses, including Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn. Yet Anne refused to become another fleeting conquest. She had witnessed her sister's fate praised, used, and discarded, and she would not repeat it. When Henry pursued her with letters and gifts, Anne stood firm. She would not yield her virtue or her position without the title of wife. Her refusal, instead of angering the king, inflamed his desire. To a man accustomed to obedience, Anne's resistance was intoxicating. For 7 long years Henry courted her, fought Rome for her, and defied his counsellors in pursuit of her. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry took a drastic step. In the year 1534, he broke from the Catholic Church and established the Church of England, declaring himself its supreme head. The following year, he secretly married Anne. On the 1st day of June, 1533, she was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Anne entered her queenship with confidence and expectation. She was already pregnant, and Henry was certain the child would be a boy, the long-awaited Tudor heir. But fate played a cruel hand. On the 7th day of September, 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was profound, but concealed beneath celebration. Henry assured his courtiers that sons would follow in time. Anne's position, however, was far from secure. Her charm, once her weapon, became her vulnerability. Unlike Catherine, who had the support of powerful allies abroad, Anne had none. Her entire existence at court depended upon the king's affection, and affection, especially Henry's, was a fickle thing. Over the next 3 years, she suffered 2 miscarriages, one in the year 1534 and another in early 1536, the latter reportedly a stillborn son. Each loss deepened Henry's frustration. The man who had defied Christendom for her now saw her as a disappointment, perhaps even a curse. Meanwhile, the people of England despised their new queen. They called her the king's whore, blaming her for Catherine's suffering and the kingdom's religious upheaval. The French regarded her as an upstart. The papal court in Rome described her as a seductress sent to lead England into sin. Even within her own homeland, she could find little sympathy. When she appeared in public, women turned their backs. Some shouted insults or threatened violence. The court, ever attuned to shifts in power, began to distance itself from her. Many nobles who had once courted her favour now aligned with her rivals. Whispers of her temper, her jealousy, and her arrogance spread through the corridors of Whitehall. Henry himself began to look elsewhere toward the quiet and compliant Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Jane's humility and soft-spoken demeanour contrasted sharply with Anne's fiery independence. To a weary king, Jane seemed the embodiment of peace after years of turbulence. By early 1536, Anne's situation had become perilous. The death of Catherine of Aragon in January removed the last moral restraint upon Henry's actions. He was now free, both legally and in conscience, to rid himself of Anne without fear of international backlash. The stage was set for her downfall. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally in reform, turned against her. Their disputes over the redistribution of church lands and foreign alliances grew bitter. Cromwell, ever pragmatic, recognized that the king's favour had shifted. In his eyes, Anne had become not only an obstacle but a danger to his own position. The woman who had once dazzled Europe now stood isolated in a court she had helped transform. No family could protect her. No allies dared speak for her. Even her father, Thomas Boleyn, bowed to political necessity. Anne's tragedy was not born of wickedness, but of circumstance, a woman elevated beyond safety by love and cast down by the same hand that had raised her. As Jane Seymour's gentle figure moved closer to the throne, Anne's shadow began to fade. The Queen of England was now a liability, and in Henry's England, liabilities were dealt with swiftly and without mercy. Her fall would come within months, and it would shake the kingdom to its core. In May of 1536, Anne Boleyn would stand accused of adultery, incest, and treason charges, so grave and sensational that no one dared to question them aloud. But before that fatal morning at Tower Green, there was still the silence of waiting, the uneasy calm before the blade descended, and the woman who once defied an empire met her end beneath the pale English sky. As the fragile bond between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn began to fracture, the factions within the English court sensed an opportunity. Those who had once flattered the Queen now turned against her. Among them was Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and a former ally in religious reform. Once united in their campaign to break England from Rome, they had grown divided over politics, power, and faith. Anne wanted to redirect the church's wealth toward education and charity, while Cromwell sought to fill the royal treasury. Their disagreement became fatal. By the spring of 1536, Cromwell understood that the king's affection for Anne had evaporated. What followed was one of the most calculated betrayals in Tudor history. Cromwell began to construct a case not of annulment, but of treason. It would be swift, theatrical, and irreversible. He assembled accusations so shocking that few dared question them. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, and a plot to murder the king. In late April of that year, Cromwell's agents arrested musician Mark Smeaton, who under torture confessed to having been intimate with the Queen. It was the only confession ever obtained. Still, it was enough. Within days, Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton and George Boleyn were all seized. Though many within the council doubted the charges, public opinion was ready to believe. To the common people, Anne Boleyn had long been the woman who led England into sin. She had replaced a beloved, saintly queen. She had divided church and nation, and now she was accused of crimes so scandalous that disbelief itself seemed dangerous. According to English law, adultery committed by a queen was not merely a sin, it was treason, a direct betrayal of the crown. The punishment was death. On the 2nd day of May, 1536, Anne was arrested at Greenwich Palace. Her brother was taken the same day. They were brought separately to the Tower of London, the ancient fortress that had once welcomed her in triumph 3 years earlier. Now its iron gates closed behind her as a prisoner. In her cell, Anne alternated between prayer and disbelief. She denied every accusation, insisting that her conscience was clear. She begged for mercy, not for freedom, but for life, asking to be sent to a convent where she might live in repentance and seclusion. But Henry refused. He would not allow an annulment or pardon. To declare the marriage invalid would mean admitting that his own religious revolution had been founded on falsehood. It would expose him as a man, not chosen by God, but deceived by passion. The king could not bear such humiliation. Anne had to die, and she had to die guilty. Her trial took place at the Tower on the 15th day of May, 1536, before a jury of peers presided over by her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. The outcome was predetermined. The witnesses were coerced, the testimonies contradictory, the evidence non-existent. Yet the verdict was unanimous: guilty of adultery, incest, and conspiracy to kill the king. Her brother George was condemned alongside her. Both were sentenced to death. On the morning of the 19th day of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn dressed herself in a gown of dark grey damask trimmed with fur. Her hair was pinned neatly beneath a white linen coif. Led by guards to Tower Green, she climbed the wooden scaffold with quiet dignity. A small crowd had gathered: nobles, courtiers, and curious onlookers. As she reached the platform, she spoke calmly. "Good Christian people," she said, "I come hither to die, according to law, for by the law I am judged to die. I pray you to bear me witness that I die in the faith of Jesus Christ, and I do not accuse any man of my death." She asked the people to pray for the king, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord. Kneeling upon the straw, she removed her headdress, tucking her hair beneath a white cap so that the sword might strike cleanly. She refused the traditional blindfold. The executioner, a swordsman from Calais summoned specially by the king, stepped forward. With a single swift motion, his blade cut through the air. Anne's head fell in one stroke. The Queen of England was dead at the age of 35. The act of beheading a crowned queen was unprecedented in English history. It was not merely vengeance or personal cruelty, it was political theatre. By destroying Anne publicly, Henry sought to rewrite the narrative of his reign. He wished to appear not as a tyrant, but as a man deceived, a king ensnared by witchcraft and betrayal. In his eyes, Anne's execution restored his purity, reaffirming him as God's anointed ruler. Yet beneath this facade lay colder motives. The death of Anne served to warn every noble in England. No one, not even a queen, stood above royal will. It silenced dissent, reinforced Henry's authority, and paved the way for his next marriage. Just 10 days later, on the 29th day of May, he wed Jane Seymour. London fell into uneasy silence. The nobility whispered in disbelief. Foreign ambassadors recorded the event in hushed tones. The people watched in horror. The scaffold at Tower Green stood as a grim reminder of how swiftly fortune could turn in the court of Henry VIII. Anne Boleyn's execution marked the end of a chapter that had begun in passion and ended in blood. It was the culmination of ambition, politics, and pride. A tragedy that exposed the peril of standing too close to the throne. Her story, once called a romance, had become a warning. In Tudor England, love could crown a woman one year and condemn her the next. While Anne Boleyn languished in isolation within the Tower of London, the Seymour family, led by the steady and calculating Edward Seymour, began their quiet ascent. His sister, Jane Seymour, emerged as the perfect contrast to Anne's fiery spirit. Where Anne was passionate and outspoken, Jane was calm, modest, and deferential. She spoke softly, dressed simply, and maintained an air of quiet devotion that appealed to a weary king tired of argument and controversy. By the mid-1530s, the court had begun to sense a shift. Whispers spread through Westminster. The Seymours are in favour. Jane's demeanour was everything Henry now longed for: obedience without challenge, serenity without ambition. Her very silence became a weapon more powerful than Anne's eloquence. As Anne suffered repeated miscarriages, her final loss in January of 1536, believed to have been a male child, rumours swirled throughout the realm. Some courtiers murmured that God himself had cursed the king for his pride. Preachers whispered that heaven had closed Catherine of Aragon's womb in sorrow and Anne's in punishment. The people, already inclined to despise Anne, seized upon these superstitions eagerly. They saw her misfortunes not as tragedy, but as divine retribution. Against this backdrop of disfavour, Jane Seymour appeared like a balm to the king's wounded pride. Gentle, pale, and pious, she seemed untouched by the vanity and turbulence of court life. To Henry, she represented purity restored, a woman who could give him peace and, perhaps more importantly, a son. Her family, sensing opportunity, played their part with careful precision. Edward Seymour strengthened his political alliances, while their brother, Sir Thomas Seymour, maintained a discreet but constant presence near the king. By February of 1536, the Seymours' influence had grown undeniable. Courtiers once loyal to Anne now shifted allegiance toward Jane. Ambassadors reported that a new star rises in the English sky. The French and imperial envoys watched closely, recognizing the emergence of a new faction, one that promised stability after years of religious and marital turmoil. Henry's affection, once burning and uncontrollable for Anne, had cooled into bitterness. The miscarriages had wounded his pride, but it was Anne's sharp tongue and unguarded temper that sealed her fate. She had been fearless enough to challenge him, jealous enough to reproach him, and proud enough to mock his weakness. Henry, who could forgive infidelity but not humiliation, began to recoil from her presence. In this atmosphere, Jane Seymour shone brighter. She was everything Anne was not: patient, yielding, and unthreatening. She spoke rarely, listened always, and knelt often. Courtiers soon learned that to praise Jane was to please the king. The Seymours' rise was not merely emotional, it was political. Edward Seymour began cultivating allies among nobles disillusioned with Anne's reforms and foreign policy. Those weary of the Boleyn's arrogance found a new patron in the soft-spoken Jane. Bishops and clergymen, unsettled by Anne's radical support for Protestant ideas, saw in Jane the promise of moderation. Even Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's staunch supporter, sensed the wind turning and began to align himself with the Seymours' camp. By March, Edward Seymour had been promoted to higher office and granted new estates. The favour of the king translated swiftly into tangible rewards. Behind the scenes, a plan took shape, not yet treason but preparation. If Anne were to fall, the Seymours would be ready to fill the void. Anne's strength had always been her singular connection to the king. She had no foreign allies, no powerful kin abroad to intervene, and no lasting support among the nobility. Her rise had depended on love, and now that love had curdled into resentment, she stood defenceless. As Henry's confidence in her faded, her enemies grew bold. Every word she spoke was twisted into arrogance, every gesture interpreted as defiance. In April, Henry began spending long hours away from Anne, preferring the company of Jane Seymour. On one occasion, a courtier found Henry holding Jane's hand, a gesture unthinkable while Anne still lived as queen. When Anne discovered it, she was said to have broken into tears, part fury, part despair. Her pleas for understanding only deepened the king's irritation. The transformation was nearly complete. The once revered queen had become a burden, a shadow of scandal and sorrow. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour, ever demure, ever silent, grew in favour day by day. To many in court, she symbolised hope, the possibility of restoring divine order to a kingdom tainted by controversy. By late April, the balance of power had shifted entirely. The Boleyn's influence waned to nothing. The Seymours' ascendancy was absolute. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, began to prepare the final act, a legal purge that would remove Anne and elevate Jane. Anne, sensing her fate, prayed in the quiet hours of night. She had gambled everything, her honour, her family, her faith, for a crown that now weighed heavier than chains. In the echoing corridors of the Tower, her name was already fading, replaced by whispers of another, Queen Jane. The story that had begun with passion was now descending into silence. The fall of Anne Boleyn was no longer a matter of love or betrayal, it was inevitability, written by the same hand that once crowned her. And in that silence, the Seymours waited, patient and unshakable. as England prepared to trade one queen's blood for another's promise. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the English Reformation and one of the sharpest political minds of the 16th century, began his career as Anne Boleyn's ally. Together, they had once shared a vision: to free England from the authority of Rome and to shape a new order where royal power would stand above papal decree. But as the years passed, their alliance fractured. What began as partnership evolved into rivalry, one driven not by faith, but by ambition. By the year 1536, Anne's influence over the king had diminished. Her passion, once a force that emboldened Henry, now irritated him. Her political opinions, once persuasive, were now dangerous. She championed an alliance with France while Cromwell favoured reconciliation with the Holy Roman Empire. Their visions of England's future diverged sharply. Where Anne saw reform as a spiritual renewal, Cromwell viewed it as an opportunity, a means to expand the monarchy's wealth and his own authority. Anne's fiery temper and outspoken criticism of corruption only deepened Cromwell's resentment. She accused him of greed, of exploiting the dissolution of monasteries for personal gain. In private, Cromwell warned his confidants that the Queen's day grows short. He understood the precariousness of her position. Henry's affection was waning. The nobility despised her, and the people called her the concubine queen. All she had left was her title, and even that, he knew, could be taken. Cromwell's genius lay not in open confrontation, but in silent manipulation. He turned his enemies into instruments, their fears into tools. By April of 1536, he began orchestrating a campaign to destroy Anne from within the walls of her own court. He placed spies among her attendants, questioned her musicians, and summoned men who had once enjoyed her favour. The confessions he gathered were built on shadows and coercion. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, was the first to be arrested. Under torture, he admitted falsely to being the Queen's lover. His words became the cornerstone of the case. From there, Cromwell's web widened. Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, and finally, Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, were named as her accomplices. The accusations were monstrous adultery with multiple men, incest with her brother, and conspiracy to murder the king. Yet Cromwell knew the logic of power. The truth mattered less than belief. The court needed a story to justify the Queen's downfall, and he gave them one crafted with precision. He submitted the charges in writing, signed and sealed, leaving no space for ambiguity. Within days, Parliament and the Privy Council accepted them without question. Even those who doubted the case dared not speak. Fear ruled England more completely than faith. When questioned, several witnesses later confessed they had been bribed or threatened into silence. But by then, it no longer mattered. The verdict was already written before the trial began. Cromwell's motives were layered, part survival, part ambition. By destroying Anne, he achieved three strategic goals. First, he eliminated a powerful opponent who had threatened his reforms and accused him publicly. Second, he secured the king's favour by appearing as a loyal servant who exposed treason within the Queen's circle. And third, he paved the way for Jane Seymour's ascension, a queen who would owe her crown to him, and by extension, her gratitude. The trial that followed was swift and merciless. On the 15th day of May, 1536, Anne was tried before a jury of peersmen handpicked by Cromwell and bound by fear of royal reprisal. Her brother was tried alongside her, both charged with treason and incest. The evidence was inconsistent. Dates of supposed meetings contradicted each other. Yet every discrepancy was ignored. In Tudor England, a royal accusation was as good as proof. When the jury returned its unanimous verdict of guilt, Cromwell stood silently in the chamber. He did not smile, but those who knew him understood the triumph in his stillness. In less than 2 weeks, the Queen, who had once defied Rome and crowned herself in majesty, would be executed by a foreign sword. Henry, relieved of his inconvenient wife, could now wed Jane Seymour without scandal. Cromwell's success was complete. The king praised him as a faithful counsellor, rewarding him with wealth and influence. Within months, he was elevated to the peerage as Baron Cromwell of Oakham, yet beneath the appearance of victory lay the first cracks in his own fate. By creating a system where accusation equaled guilt, Cromwell had built a weapon so sharp it could turn against anyone, even himself. But for the moment, he stood unchallenged, the quiet master of England's destiny. Anne's death on the 19th day of May sealed his triumph. The morning air at Tower Green carried no cries, only the whisper of steel through silence. Cromwell watched from a distance as the woman who had once been queen fell beneath the blade. With her last breath, she prayed for the king's soul, a gesture of grace that history would remember, though her contemporaries did not. For Cromwell, it was the perfect ending to an imperfect plan. He had neutralized his rival, satisfied the king, and secured his legacy as the man who could make and unmake queens. But power in Tudor England was fleeting. The same precision with which he had destroyed Anne Boleyn would one day script his own fall. For now, however, the tower stood silent, the executioner's sword gleaming faintly in the morning sun, the final punctuation in a chapter written by ambition, betrayal, and the cold arithmetic of survival. At dawn on the 19th day of May, 1536, Tower Green stood shrouded in a thin mist. Within its wooden scaffolding, carpenters had worked through the night to raise the platform where England's most tragic queen would take her final breath. The air was cold, unnaturally still, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Anne Boleyn, once the radiant jewel of the Tudor court, now stepped forward dressed in a gown of pure white, the colour of innocence and of sacrifice. A cloak of deep crimson lay over her shoulders, its edges brushing against the damp straw beneath her feet. Beneath her linen coif, her dark eyes remained calm, almost luminous, as though she had already crossed the threshold between life and death. At approximately 8 o'clock, the lieutenant of the tower escorted her onto the scaffold. The crowd gathered nobles, courtiers, foreign envoys, and common citizens, all summoned by curiosity, duty, or dread. The murmurs fell silent as Anne climbed the steps. When she reached the platform, she turned to face the onlookers, her voice clear and composed despite the chill that bit the morning air. "Good Christian people," she began softly, "I am come hither to die according to the law. I have not accused any man. I pray you to pray for the king's majesty, for he is a gentle and gracious lord." Her words, delivered without bitterness, carried through the courtyard. Even her executioner, a French swordsman brought from Calais by Henry's command, was said to have been moved by her serenity. When she knelt upon the straw, her ladies-in-waiting wept openly. One handed her a small cloth to cover her eyes, but she refused it. "I shall die with open eyes," she whispered. A faint breeze stirred the white veil upon her head. The swordsman, trained in the swift art of mercy, murmured in French to distract her, "Where is my sword?" Then struck a single, perfect blow. The blade flashed once in the morning Sunday. Then silence. Anne Boleyn's head fell gently onto the straw, her lips still parted as if mid-prayer. The blood pooled quietly at her knees. The Queen of England, the woman for whom a church had been torn from Rome, was gone at 35. London reacted in shock, though not in unity. The city divided itself, as it always did in times of royal scandal. Some citizens wept for her, whispering prayers in taverns and doorways, lamenting the cruelty of the act. Others rejoiced openly, calling her the witch who led England astray. The cobbled streets echoed with both mourning and malice. At court, the reaction was just as fractured. The ladies who had once attended her fainted or sobbed behind closed doors. Yet others, weary of her arrogance, muttered that justice had been done. One noblewoman was heard to remark coldly, "The air will be sweeter now." Foreign merchants and ambassadors sent their observations across Europe. The French, once charmed by Anne's wit, mocked England for executing its own creation. In Parisian salons, poets sneered that Henry had slain the flower he himself had grown. In Spain, courtiers rejoiced. To them, it was divine vengeance for the humiliation of Catherine of Aragon. Even the Vatican, long at odds with the English crown, noted that he who breaks with Rome finds his own sword turned inward. In the markets of London, pamphlets and ballads appeared within days. Some praised Anne's courage. She died a queen and smiled at death. Others mocked her downfall. Anne, once the jewel of Tudor pride, now lies beneath the tower's tide. The city's printers made a fortune from her story, and every telling twisted it differently. Saint or sinner, martyr or witch. For the people who had once watched her process through the streets in triumph only 3 years earlier, the transformation was dizzying. On the first day of June, 1533, Anne had ridden in splendour to her coronation at Westminster Abbey, crowned amid cheers and golden confetti. Now, only 3 years later, her body was buried in an unmarked grave within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, a few steps from where she had knelt to die. In the weeks that followed, London seemed to hum with unease. The Thames carried whispers from the Tower to the palace. If a queen can fall so easily, who can stand secure? The people began to view Henry not as a lover betrayed, but as a ruler consumed by paranoia. The execution of Anne Boleyn revealed a truth the king could never conceal, that his power was absolute and his mercy fleeting. By evening the scaffold was dismantled. The straw, soaked in blood, was burned. Yet the memory lingered like a wound that refused to close. For centuries, that morning on Tower Green would be remembered not merely as the end of a queen, but as the moment England looked upon its monarch and saw, for the first time, the face of tyranny. Anne's death was not the end of a scandal, but the beginning of a legend. Even as her body lay cold beneath the stones, her story travelled far beyond London across Europe, into the hearts of poets, painters, and dreamers. They would remember her not as the condemned wife of Henry VIII, but as a woman who dared to rise higher than any had before, and who paid for that ascent with her life. The winds that blew through Tower Green that morning carried away the last echoes of her voice, leaving only silence, the kind of silence that falls after a storm, heavy and unending. In the days following the 19th of May, 1536, a strange quiet fell over the English court. It was not the silence of mourning, but of erasure. The once celebrated Queen of England, Anne Boleyn, was to be remembered no more. At Henry's command, every trace of her existence, portraits, letters, jewellery, emblems, was to be destroyed or hidden away. Her crowned falcon emblem was chiselled from the palace walls. Her initials intertwined with the king's were scraped from tapestries and carved beams. Even the motto she had once chosen, "The Most Happy," was banned from being spoken. Within a week, it was as though she had never been. Henry's order was swift and absolute. Courtiers were warned never to utter her name. Her personal rooms in Whitehall and Hampton Court were stripped bare. Her portraits were either burned or altered beyond recognition, the faces repainted, her likeness replaced by nameless noblewomen. In the royal inventories, items once marked the Queen's jewels were reassigned to the property of the crown. Anne's letters, filled with the tenderness and wit that had once enthralled the king, were collected and sealed in the royal archives, where most would vanish forever. To those who witnessed it, this purge was more than a gesture of spite. It was a deliberate rewriting of history, an attempt to ensure that Anne Boleyn would never become a symbol of resistance. Henry knew that a martyr queen could be far more dangerous than a living one. By erasing her image, he sought to erase her influence. Yet even in destruction, traces of grief lingered. The Spanish ambassador Eustache Chapuis, long an enemy of Anne and defender of Catherine of Aragon, recorded a curious observation. In a private audience days after the execution, he saw tears glisten in the king's eyes when the subject of Anne was mentioned. "The king wept," Chapuis wrote, "not for guilt, but for memory." Perhaps Henry mourned the woman who had once made him defy the world. Perhaps he wept for the man he had been when he loved her. Whatever the cause, the moment was brief. The next day, he resumed his affairs with renewed vigour, declaring, "None shall stand above the throne but I." For the Boleyn family, the fall was total. Thomas Boleyn, once a proud ambassador and father of a queen, lost nearly everything. His estates were seized, his influence evaporated. He was left to wander the periphery of court, a ghost of his former self, despised by those who had once envied him. Anne's brother, George Boleyn, executed alongside her, had his title stripped and his lineage blotted from the peerage. The family's heraldic crests were taken down from the halls of honour. The Boleyn name became synonymous with disgrace. Many who had supported Anne, her ladies, servants, and distant kin were dismissed or interrogated. Some fled to the countryside. Others were quietly imprisoned. It was as though the court itself had turned into a machine of forgetting, devouring every connection to the queen it had once served. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour, the woman who had replaced her, sat quietly at Wolf Hall, preparing for her entry into history. Barely 11 days after Anne's death, on the 30th of May, 1536, she became Henry's third wife. The ceremony was private and swift, conducted in the presence of a few trusted courtiers. The ink on Anne's death warrant had scarcely dried when a new queen was crowned in the king's heart. To the public, this abrupt transition confirmed what many already believed, that Anne's death had been a political necessity, not divine justice. In taverns and marketplaces, Londoners whispered that the king had planned the marriage before the execution. Some even claimed Jane had worn Anne's jewels at the wedding, though no record confirms it. Still, the symbolism was unmistakable. One woman's blood had cleared the path for another's crown. The foreign courts watched in disbelief. France, once allied with Anne through her upbringing and sympathies, now viewed England as a realm governed by fear. In the Spanish court, Queen Catherine's former allies rejoiced, declaring that heaven had avenged her humiliation. The Emperor Charles V received the news with cold satisfaction, remarking, "The whore is dead." Henry, however, was unmoved by criticism. He presented himself as the restorer of divine order, the man who had purged corruption from his throne. In private, he immersed himself in statecraft, reforms, and the business of securing his new marriage. But even as he appeared unshaken, those closest to him sensed a change, a shadow behind the crown. He laughed louder, ruled harsher, and trusted fewer men than before. The purge of Anne's memory served its purpose. Her name vanished from official records, her voice silenced in songs and sermons. But history, as it always does, found ways to whisper her back into existence. A few servants secretly preserved her letters. A painter, unwilling to forget, kept a copy of her portrait hidden behind another canvas. And in time, the daughter she had borne, the infant Elizabeth, then barely 3 years old, would carry her mother's name, not in shame, but in triumph. For now, however, England lay under the weight of forgetting. The fires that burned Anne's letters crackled in palace hearths, their smoke curling up into the cold May sky. The Tower of London stood quiet again, its stones stained by the memory of a queen erased. And Henry, alone in his chambers, stared into the embers of that fire, a king who had conquered everything but peace. Though Anne Boleyn was condemned for adultery and treason, posterity has judged her differently. To later generations, she was not a criminal but a catalyst, the mother of Queen Elizabeth I, and the victim of one of the most calculated political purges in Tudor history. Archival discoveries and re-examinations of 16th century court records reveal striking inconsistencies in her trial. The dates of alleged affairs conflicted with her documented whereabouts, and several of her supposed accomplices were proven to be elsewhere. Modern historians largely agree that the charges lacked any factual foundation. What destroyed Anne was not sin, but strategy. Her death, however, gave birth to a legend. Elizabeth, her only surviving child, would ascend the throne in 1558 and reign for 45 years, guiding England through an age of unparalleled cultural and political transformation. In Elizabeth's intellect, wit, and indomitable spirit, many saw the reflection of the mother she never knew. Anne, executed and erased, was thus reborn through her daughter's triumph. History, which had silenced her voice, found it speaking again from the lips of a queen. Catherine of Aragon, by contrast, met her end far from the court that had humiliated her. She died in January of 1536, only months before Anne's execution, at Kimbolton Castle alone, but unbroken. To the people of England, and to her native Spain, Catherine remained the embodiment of endurance and dignity. She had refused to accept the annulment of her marriage, insisting until her final breath that she was Henry's true and lawful wife. Her letters, composed in her final weeks, revealed neither hatred nor fear. "Mine eyes desire you above all things," she wrote to Henry. "May God judge between us." The contrast between the two women could not have been sharper. Catherine represented the old order faith, tradition, alliance with Rome. Anne embodied the new reform, ambition, and the peril of change. Catherine's defence of her marriage became a moral touchstone, Anne's downfall a political lesson. Where Catherine's integrity earned her posthumous reverence as the unconquered queen, Anne's passion transformed her into the archetype of the tragic reformer. Their daughters, too, carried forward their mother's destinies. Mary Tudor, Catherine's child, ascended the throne in 1553. Determined to restore the Catholic faith, she reversed her father's reforms and married Philip II of Spain, uniting England once more with the empire that had once protected her mother. But her reign was haunted by persecution and loss. When she died 5 years later, in 1558, the crown passed to her half-sister Elizabeth Anne's daughter. Thus, the two women who had once warred for Henry's favour became forever entwined through their children, whose reigns defined an age. The story of Catherine and Anne reveals a brutal truth about Tudor politics. In that glittering court of jewels and sermons, power was a battlefield where faith and affection were weapons, not shields. Bloodlines and alliances determined survival far more than virtue or love. Catherine endured because she was protected by Spain, the emperor, and the moral authority of the church. Anne, by contrast, had no empire behind her, only the heart of a man whose love was both her crown and her curse. When that love turned to suspicion, no law or lineage could save her. It was a cruel arithmetic. Catherine's strength lay in her alliances, Anne's in her defiance. One was safeguarded by empires, the other stood alone before the throne. In the Tudor world, faithfulness to power, not to conscience, dictated who lived and who fell. And yet, across the centuries, the two queens have come to symbolize more than rivalry. Catherine endures as the image of moral steadfastness, the woman who would not bend even under royal tyranny. Anne survives as the emblem of courage against the impossible, a woman who dared to dream beyond her station, to challenge a king and a church, and to shape the destiny of England through her brief, blazing life. In the quiet corridors of history, they no longer stand as enemies but as twin pillars of the same tragedy. Two women crushed by the same crown, bound by love to the same man, and remembered by time as voices of conviction in an age of cruelty. Their stories whisper a single lesson: that power without conscience devours all, and that even the mightiest throne is built upon the bones of those who dared to stand too close to it. And so, in the dim light of the Tudor past, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn remain not as rivals, but as echoes. One, the unyielding queen of faith; the other, the fallen queen of fire. Both immortal. And now, as the candles fade and the corridors of time grow quiet, we find ourselves standing between two shadows, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Their stories, though divided by jealousy and fate, drift together like twin echoes through the centuries. One woman, steady and devout, anchored in faith and dignity. The other, radiant and daring, blazing like a comet across the Tudor sky. Both loved, both betrayed, both immortal, in the memory of a kingdom that learned too late the cost of power. If you close your eyes, you might still hear the distant sound of church bells from Westminster, the gentle rustle of silk gowns brushing against cold stone. You might see Catherine kneeling in silent prayer, her lips murmuring forgiveness for the man who wronged her. And somewhere, not far away, Anne stands beneath the soft morning light, her eyes lifted toward the sky, calm and unafraid, as though she already knows her story will not end here. Their paths, once enemies, now meet in peace. Catherine's endurance shaped Mary's crown. Anne's brilliance gave rise to Elizabeth's golden age. Two mothers, two daughters, and between them, the long breath of history, filled with lessons about courage, pride, and the unyielding spirit of women who refuse to disappear. The story of these two queens reminds us that justice, though delayed, always finds its way. That truth, though buried, never dies. And that love, whether in devotion or in defiance, is the quiet force that shapes the world long after we are gone. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Catherine and Anne. Not the crowns they lost or the blood they shed, but the light they left behind for those who came after. So as the palace torches dim and the river Thames murmurs softly under the moonlight, let your heart rest. Let the noise of the court fade away the clamour of ambition, the whisper of betrayal, and listen instead to the hush of history breathing through the night. Because in that stillness, you will find not tragedy, but peace. The kind of peace that comes from understanding that even in the harshest times, grace can endure. And even in the darkest endings, there is always a quiet dawn. Sleep now, traveller of time. Dream of distant castles and silent queens whose stories still shimmer beneath the centuries. May their courage cradle you through the night, and their wisdom follow you into the morning light. And before you drift away, remember to subscribe so that when the next story unfolds, you'll be here with us again, listening, dreaming, and wandering gently through the pages of history. Good night, my friend. Rest well.